not very good, and we talked about those beaches that were not even in the study. So the estimates for actual costs and damages were not very good. There was no mitigation or compensation coming from the federal government, which by law should have been done. So Plan 2014, it betrays the commitment we made. And I think Henry might want to speak a little bit about this, and I'm going to skip through because what action steps we've already talked about. We need to get the new commissioners in there. We need to eliminate Plan 2014 if we can. But at a minimum, we need to get the high triggers lowered. They're way too high, and the low triggers raised. Henry, do you want to take over from here?
Thank you, Tony. Good evening. It's very nice to see all of you here. We're really pleased that there would be such a good turnout, and we hope the turnouts will keep going for much longer. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So my name is Henry Stewart, and at this time I would like to break away from the visual presentation a bit and talk about experiences of what has brought us to this point and where we might go from here to stand up against what we now have. I will repeat some aspects of what you've heard from many of the other speakers, but those points I believe bear repeating in many instances. Please consider two words: civil disobedience, a concept espoused by the famous naturalist Henry David Thoreau. Should one encourage it? Well, let us take a look at the options, and I ask you to be the judge. We are now faced, quite dramatically as noted, with the presence of Plan 2014. Some of us might never have expected it to arrive at our doors. And yet, how did it actually come about? Is Plan 2014 the cause of the flooding and catastrophic conditions that we have seen along the lake shore? And if so, how do we really make it go away? Now, the International Joint Commission, the IJC, as has been noted, has continually claimed in the news and otherwise that the cause of the high water, flooding, and resulting damages that we have seen this year has not been Plan 2014, but rather Mother Nature. We can accede to the idea that nature has brought considerable rain this year, even record amounts of rain. But we may be hard-pressed to remember record levels of snowfall this past winter. Certainly precipitation and runoff have played their roles, but there have been massive rains and record snowfalls in the past, and yet this year has been dramatically different on Lake Ontario and indeed on the St. Lawrence River. And what is different this year is Plan 2014. I have been involved with water level issues on Lake Ontario since 1993. In 1990, I found a plot of land on the shore of Lake Ontario and the shore of Sodus Bay. And for a very brief period in my life, I felt that I could afford to buy a modest lakefront property. In 1991, I bought that land, and in 1992, I was able to have a modest, rustic, yet very nice small cottage erected on it. In 1993, I was asked to join an organization known and abbreviated as LOSS, L-O-S-S, which stands for the Lake Ontario South Shore Council. And soon thereafter, I was asked to serve as its president. And since that time, in 1993, I've been intensely involved in lake level issues. I want to commend this group, United Shoreline, for its efforts and its initial successes in working to band together property owners along the Lake Ontario shoreline and beachfront associations with a desire to stand up to and against the circumstances wreaking havoc along these shores. For years, the Lake Ontario South Shore Council did and has done this, seeking to band shoreline property owners together to speak with a shared voice and to address the actions of the IJC and the St. Lawrence River Board of Control in their regulation of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River under the prior regulation plan referred to as Plan 1958 DD. With no office or staff, I and other members of LOS would repeatedly draft and print lengthy newsletters which we would seek to provide by hand, driving along the lakeshore roadways and delivering the newsletters to property owners' doors, telling of current issues and urging collective efforts. And typically, relying on membership contributions, we might spend $1,000 on the printing of a newsletter, replenish a similar amount through contributions generated from that effort, and be ready when issues demanded to print and distribute another newsletter. Continually, we would speak out on behalf of lakeshore dwellers and property owners' interests at public meetings of the Army, Corps of Engineers, and the St. Lawrence River Board of Control. And as we worked toward coalescence of interest to create a network of representatives from beach locations and shorefront organizations along the lakeshore, we found it extremely difficult and frankly quite frustrating, as people's interests in staying with the cause copacetically lessened when water levels comfortably dropped. Now, with no signs of the water levels comfortably dropping, it is nonsense for lakeshore property owners to stay away from this cause. For what we need now is evident in this room and what needs to be occurring all along the lakeshore: unification, and ability to speak with a strong, unified, collective, and single voice. As I mentioned, I've been at this effort for a long time, seeking to stand up against the powerful interests which regulate the water levels in Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. And during these 24 years of efforts, I've continually observed how strong and powerful, moneyed, and well-funded everyone else involved is, except for the lakeshore riparians. So many non-lakeshore dwellers, offering or venting criticism, choose to claim that we lakeshore property owners are all so wealthy. So apparently one should think that we are all moneyed, well-funded, and financially equipped to stand, collectively or individually, against the onslaught of those who would wish to bring high water to and against us. Yet, we are not so equipped. Or if we are, the collective joinder to fund intensive lobbying efforts on our behalf has never been adequate. Clearly, the other stakeholder interests have effective overt or covert lobbying efforts and the financial means to support them. Shipping, as we know, is a mega million-dollar or even mega billion-dollar industry with massive efforts to assert their interests. Hydropower, too. The environmental interests are able to rely on resources gained through charitable contributions, as entities such as the Nature Conservancy strongly assert their desires. Even when seemingly grassroots, the environmental entities have well-funded offices, staffs, and budgets for their cause. For years, the environmental group called Save the River has had its office, albeit small, in Clayton, New York. Where, one might ask, is there an actual office funded to be dedicated to the interests and the plights of the lakefront property owner along Lake Ontario? While the environmental lobby seems to have gained victory with Plan 2014, the question may be asked whether that victory would have been achieved without considerable help from a government entity, most particularly the involvement of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC. For decades, it has been rumored that the agenda of the DEC has been to succeed in wiping lakefront property owners' homes and cottages off the New York State shores of Lake Ontario, with the land thereafter to become public lands of New York State. Some within our collective efforts have even stated that they have heard officials state this intention. Yet how could it really be so, one might have asked? And now we have Plan 2014. Plan 2014, created as noted by a committee meeting behind closed doors, without public involvement or scrutiny, and apparently dominated by representatives of environmental concerns, and especially representatives of the New York State DEC. And so again, how did we get to this point, and what do we do now? Many of us may recall that in the 1990s, there was high water on Lake Ontario a few, if not several times. I recall high water, particularly in 1993, and then again in 1997 and even 1998. Not as high as we have had this year, but nevertheless perilously high. Those circumstances, of course, were under the prior plan of regulation, Plan 1958 DD. And plenty of lakeshore property owners were complaining then, as frequently, about the conditions under Plan 58 DD. Through the IJC, a change in regulation was proposed that I believe was called Plan 1997, and public hearings were rolled out then about that proposal. And quite stridently and vociferously, the public shot that plan down, particularly as it seemed that it would create worse conditions for us than under Plan 58 DD. Leading up to the year 2000, the IJC then announced that it had gained funding for a $20 million 5-year study to examine whether or not a plan of regulation could be adopted that was better than Plan 1958 DD. That study, known as the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Study, began in 2000 and was to be funded through 2005. Among the supposed beauties of that study was that all stakeholder interests would be involved in the study process, including shoreline and riverfront property owner interests, recreational boating interests, and environmental interests, as well as commercial navigation and shipping, hydropower, and municipal water intake and discharge interests. Of greatest beauty, it seemed, was that the public was to be integrally involved in the process, internally and from the beginning, rather than to be addressed only through public hearings after plan formulation had occurred. Along with the study board, consisting of 6 individuals from the US and 6 from Canada, a board known as the Public Interest Advisory Group, abbreviated as the PAG, was formed by the IJC. The PAG, to be comprised of 12 people from the US and 12 from Canada, was formed not as a decision-making group, but to be a conduit of information from the public to the study and of information from the internal workings of the study to the public. So it seemed quite wonderful, actually, transparency with the public to be included and involved from the beginning. I, along with Tony McKenna and a few others from the area, including Dan Barletta of Greece, were designated to be members of the Public Interest Advisory Group. And we served on that group throughout the years of the study, even as it continued for a few years past 2005. And so throughout that period of time, we traveled for meetings to localities around the water basin, including Ottawa, Toronto, Niagara Falls, Cornwall, Messina, Ogdensburg, St. Catharines, as well as to Washington, D.C., believing that each of us was working very hard to represent the public's interests with regard to the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Study. I will tell you that on at least a few occasions, I began to wonder if we were quite being co-opted, as I began to observe that some of those meetings were being scheduled and held at the very same time as public meetings of the Army Corps of Engineers and the St. Lawrence River Board of Control were being held elsewhere, thus keeping some of us more vocal lakeshore property owners from speaking out, as we had long done at those public meetings. And to our concern, as we would listen at study board meetings, we began to hear pronouncements that Plan 1958 DD had long provided benefits to property owners along Lake Ontario, that whatever plan was ultimately to be proposed, it would inevitably cause damages to the south shore of Lake Ontario, both to protected properties and particularly to unprotected lands, that those damages were to be labeled less as damages and more as, quote, reductions in benefits, and that in any event, there would be no mitigation against or compensation for those damages or reductions in benefits, as neither the IJC nor any related government entities had funds to provide such mitigation or compensation. When any of us spoke up to counter such viewpoints and statements, it often felt like we were being viewed as having 3 or more heads. And despite our efforts to question or challenge the science on which the presumptions and decisions were moving forward within the study, and to assert that valuations of property were being skewed as working groups within the study sought to minimize the values to be placed on damages to dwellings, structures, break walls, and lands, adequate adjustments in such valuations were never made. As the study was concluding, the study board made recommendations to the IJC as to formulation of a new regulatory plan, and the IJC rolled out to the public at numerous public hearings its first proposed plan resulting from the study. At this point, without looking back, I cannot recall all of the names. Tony referred to A, B, D. At one point, a plan called Plan 2007 was proposed, and at another point, I recall, a plan called Plan BV7 was put forth. In each instance, at the public hearings, the proposed plans met with strong negative reaction from the public. Perhaps some of you were at some of these meetings. And yet, despite that negative reaction, the U.S. chairperson of the IJC, at one point, wrote to the sitting U.S. Secretary of State indicating that one of those such plans had universal support and almost no negative review. And as we waited in fear for a pronouncement that such would be the new regulation plan, we heard nothing. And we began to hope that the IJC and the U.S. Department of State would ultimately push forward no change that would be adverse to us. Only after the beginning of a new presidential administration and the eventual selection of new U.S. IJC Commission members did it seem that we were not to be free and clear. And as the Lake Ontario-St. Lawrence River study was truly beyond being at an end, and it seemed that the IJC, Commission members, and staff had not achieved what they evidently wished, a working group was formed to meet behind closed doors without true public involvement, and that is the group stacked with representatives of environmental interests that ultimately put forth Plan 2014. As noted, that plan was not a plan that came out of the International Lake Ontario-St. Lawrence River study. It disproportionately hurts the New York State lake shore, the shoreline of Lake Ontario, leaving the Canadian shoreline, as agreed upon and as noted, either without damages or far less damage. Perhaps that is why we understand that few people in Canada have even become aware of Plan 2014. The plan has been put in place with no inclusion of mitigation or compensation to address the losses and damages which it will cause and has already caused. The plan has far deflated the valuations of the losses and damages. The plan has been adopted without transparency and fair stakeholder and public input. And of crucial importance, as noted, by eliminating Plan 1958 DD's Criterion K and by the substitution of the ineffective trigger levels which continually move, the plan has eliminated the opportunity for and the ability of the River Board of Control, which is the day-to-day regulator of this lake and river system, to provide deviations to water flows to help avoid disaster being caused to the lake and river waterfronts. And if you think that the public has really been involved in the ultimate decision-making process leading up to all of this, perhaps you might instead view the situation from the perspective of the lakefront property owner who has been lulled comatose by IJC presentations, to await a chance to be heard and listened to at IJC meetings, only to never get the chance to speak, or to be cut off by commission members acting in the interests of the expediency of their own time. And so here we are with a new plan, passed through by the IJC and the State Department of the outgoing U.S. presidential administration in the last month of that administration, as noted, and after creation totally behind doors that did not open for the public. And now we should ask, what do we do? The trouble is, so many things that we might wish to do, actions that we might wish to take, would be futile. Some people say, sue the IJC. And some governmental entities, such as the town of Greece and the village of Sodas Point a few months ago, enacted resolutions urging their respective counties, Monroe and Wayne, to sue the IJC and or to take all possible legal action to work to negate Plan 2014. That would seem to be very nice as a gesture. On some politicians' part, it might seem to be grandstanding. On other politicians' part, as I'm sure the mayor here, I'm sure it's a very well-meant intention and might be commendable. But the fact is that the IJC is, and has long been, immune from suit. And not that I know so much, but I was on television a good bit stating that circumstance that the IJC is immune from suit. And weeks later, the town attorneys for the town of Greece provided their very fine legal research that the IJC was immune from suit and could not successfully be sued. That immunity falls under the umbrella of diplomatic immunity, and sadly, it's a bit like being run over by the son of an ambassador or embassy staff member driving an embassy car in Washington, D.C., and finding that that person, or the car owner, is free and clear from suit. In fact, the entity of which I have been president, the Lake Ontario South Shore Council, years before I was involved in the 1980s, sued the government over circumstances related to flooding on Lake Ontario. But then they too were unable to successfully name the IJC as a defendant. And instead they sued the Army Corps of Engineers as representative of the US government and the New York State Power Authority as representative of the government of New York State. Well, here I frankly suggest neither of those entities is the cohort in crime. And yet, crime, it really is. Even if one did try to commence a civil lawsuit, such would be extremely costly, and government attorneys would undoubtedly paper the plaintiffs to total loss of funds, ultimately to succeed with dismissal of the lawsuit, as has happened in many civil actions against the Army Corps of Engineers elsewhere in the country. Indeed, the lawsuit brought by loss created $86,000 in legal fees for the firm of Harder, Seacrest, and Emery in Rochester, which was only to be paid by a settlement in which little was achieved, but payment of $25,000 toward the plaintiff's legal fees by the Army Corps of Engineers, payment of $25,000 toward the plaintiff's legal fees by the New York State Power Authority, which thus was supplementing a $20,000 state earmark that the assemblyman, who was an uncle of one of the attorneys, managed to secure for that firm to even consider suit, and leaving then $16,000 to be raised among lakeshore property owners. So, a nice fee, one might observe, for the attorneys. And what was gained by that suit? But a pronouncement that a lakeshore waterfront property owner has the right to sue the government for flooding, erosion, and loss of property as an unconstitutional taking of property under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution without just compensation. Again, a nice pronouncement, but quite ineffective without resources to assert that right and or a non-immune defendant to sue. The question arises as to whether the immunity of the IJC extends to criminal prosecution, though. And I have asserted on television news and elsewhere that it may be an open question, at least worthy of having some taxpayer-funded prosecutor consider making a good name for himself or herself by publicly contemplating bringing and even bringing the action. At least criminal prosecution would not bankrupt our wallets and our pocketbooks. And since the IJC commissioners made their decision to enact Plan 2014, knowing that it would cause and/or fail to protect against the damages that have occurred, and thus with the specific intent to cause or allow those damages to occur, I respectfully have argued that a crime has been committed and is occurring. To be quite frank, I have not met any individuals whom I perceive more deserving of the label criminal than the most recent commissioners of the IJC. And yet I have noted my views to the Wayne County District Attorney's Office and the Office of the New York State General, not the specific office of the prior speaker, but the overall New York State Attorney General's office. And I have not heard any interest or seen any bravery put forth on their account. Perhaps a legal action seeking an injunction against the IJC and the River Board of Control to halt the further implementation of Plan 2014 might have some possibility as at least an action contained in a brief time as opposed to a years-long battle. But again, money talks, and it is difficult to find attorneys who would or could take the case on for little retainer or without being sunk in the process. Meanwhile, we might wish to hope for the help of politicians and elected officials, but with all due and great respect to a few of such individuals who are here and seem to really care and want to help with these issues, many politicians only seem to want to grandstand for self-aggrandizement or to show up when it suits their own purposes, if they even wish to get involved at all. And so we carry on, trying to put the word out as to how critical these issues are, working as the Lake Ontario Riparian Alliance, referred to as LORA, also does to bring attention to the cause. Now, I am pleased to be a director of LORA, along with Tony McKenna, Dan Barletta of Greece, Jack Steinkamp of Sodas Point, and Jim Jerome of Watertown. And I and Dan Barletta are now on our 86th edited issue of the Leveler, which you may have seen, trying to keep people up to date about these issues. But what do we do when all or so much seems futile? When we try the legal routes, the public advocacy and lobbying routes, the co-opting and pseudo-inclusion routes, and nothing seems to work. What do? Do we resort to civil disobedience? Do we stand up peaceably to authority with a willingness to take a risk? I'm not advocating it, I'm just raising the question. For I know that it goes to the very principles of action on which our country is founded. I also know, however, that forces nowadays work in ways that can shut down such action before it even gets started. If you have any clear-headed, rational, peaceable theories as to how to stand up against authority, to protest, and to be effectively heard, please let us know. We want to be careful not to rabble-rouse. Sit-ins, peace demonstrations are things of the past perhaps, but they have had a place and been effective. As I say, it's wonderful to see such a large group of people here in collaborative and shared desire to stand up for our rights as Lake Shore property owners. The need for our shared voice is critical, for we face such enormous damages and the potential for future damages now. In the past, our voice and the level of property owners' interests has ebbed, flowed, and waned as conditions have gone from critical to acceptable and comfortable. Nothing under Plan 2014 is acceptable or comfortable. Our voices need to be heard, shared, and in unison. Please don't go home and go away from demonstrating interest in this fight. It is a fight, and if we do not win, our properties will be lost. We are beginning to focus a bit more on the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, the very pieces of paper that stood for the creation and caused the creation of the IJC. There's critical language in there. I'm just going to read it to you because it really has begun to seem very critical. I'll read two paragraphs very quickly. One is very discretionary. The other is very mandatory. It says that the commission, in its discretion, may make its approval of a plan conditional upon the construction of remedial or protective works to compensate so far as possible for the particular use or diversion proposed, and in such cases may require that suitable and adequate provision approved by the commission be made for the protection and indemnity against injury of all interests on the other side of the boundary. The next paragraph is what's really key. In cases involving the elevation of the natural level of waters on either side of the line as a result of the construction or maintenance on the other side of remedial or protective works, or dams or other obstructions in boundary waters, or in waters flowing therefrom, or in waters below the boundary and rivers flowing across the boundary, the commission shall require, as a condition of its approval of such a plan, that suitable and adequate provision approved by it be made for the protection and indemnity of all interests on the other side of the line which may be injured thereby. Well, now you hear about this other side of the line. So we have the line going all the way through Lake Ontario, for example, and all the way up the St. Lawrence River. Okay, so we're talking about something on one side of the line versus the other. The fact is the Moses Saunders Dam, which is really the key point for, at least one of the very key points for how this all gets regulated, that spans the entire river from Canada to the US. That's on both sides of the line. So when they enact this, they clearly, by their guiding light, this Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, they had to adhere to this. They had to allow for compensation or mitigation. They did not. They spoke in the meetings we attended saying that they would not. So what sort of decision-making responsibility is that on their part? So as I say, this is a fight. If we do not win, our properties will be lost. So I urge you, please, whatever you do as you go home tonight, please, I urge you, stay with this fight, stay involved, and I thank you very much.
At this time, I'd like to thank everybody behind the scenes, all of our distinguished guest speakers, the wonderful kids with the books in the foyer. And just to let you know, and I would also like to point out the fact that we have the mayor of Sodas Point with us here tonight. I'm so happy to see you here. And we're going to be in your neighborhood in 2 weeks. Okay, our next rally will be Friday, September 22nd at 6:30. Sodas High School, 54 Mill Street in Sodas, New York. If you can't join us, please stick together. And one more thing. We have a representative from Chris Collins' office who'd be happy to speak to anybody after the presentation. I would like to say one more thing. The woman down here in the blue shirt, she's organized. Sharon Locke, my partner here, has organized everything. All the paperwork before you, all the emails, the Facebook, and everything is done by her. There are only two of us. Involved in this, and you stay on task with us. Thank you very much.